All right, great. Welcome, right? So today we're going to be talking about the nervous system, okay, as per the grade 12 syllabus. Yeah, these are my notes from last year. I've just touched them up a little bit. You can see I did this 9th June. Not the section, just these notes, right? So I'm just going to maximize the screen. Great. I think you can see this, right? Okay, so we're going to be talking about the nervous system, right? Now, your syllabus wants you to understand that this is the part of the being, not just humans, but other animals have them. We'll just be focusing on the human nervous system in particular. But this is the center that controls everything, right? But apart from looking at it as a center of control, right? Here your curriculum focuses on perception, okay? So sensory impulses, right? You know that you perceive the world, you understand the world through your senses, right? The 5 of them. And that can only be interpreted by the brain, right? And the whole system that does this, that takes these external stimuli of touch, taste, smell, sight, and all of that, and converts it, but before converting, transports it to the body, to the relevant centers where the conversion happens, and interprets this as feeling, right? Whether someone slaps you, and if it's a hard or soft slap, right, is determined by pressure sensors, right, in the sorry, sensors in your skin, right? Those pressure sensors detect this stimulus, which is the slap in the form of the force hitting your skin, and that is transmitted via a system of neurons, right, as you know, to the brain, or rather to the spinal cord and to the brain, and it's interpreted. So your brain then says they take this particular, this, we call it an impulse, right? That information that was transported from your skin to the brain, called an impulse. And this impulse is interpreted, right? So obviously it's very, very specific, you have to understand. So the brain is able to, we're still not entirely sure how it's able to do this. Very fascinating area of study. But it does, right? It takes this impulse, this particular bit of information that has been provided to it by the the external stimulus, and it transmits it to something your brain can interpret, like, oh, this is hot, oh, this is cold, oh, this is loud, right? It's very bright, that kind of thing. When there's a lot of light shining into your retina and your um, the optic nerve carries that impulse, that information, right? I for impulse, I for information is a piece of information like data, right? Like if you do IT or programming, a bit, right? It's basically a bit, and that's being transported through the body. Okay, there's two ways: chemical transportation as well as electrical transportation. And you know that neurons are the transport system, right? Think of it like the railways, the system of communication. It takes these impulses throughout the body, okay? But apart from, well, you can see through here, nerve cells are called neurons, okay? And I'm getting to the specifics now. I'm just giving you a nice overview of what this whole thing is about. Apart from interpreting stimulus, it also has a role in movement, right? You know that your brain controls your movements, your coordination, and it does that again through neurons. Neurons transmit these impulses. Now, before, when we were interpreting how you smell, see, touch, feel, right, taste, we talked about information being transmitted from the site of stimulus to the brain, right, through neurons. That impulse is taken, right? Now we're talking about the brain is able to send its own impulses, right, electrical impulses throughout the body wherever it needs to go, using the spinal cord as a sort of um, substation, so to speak, and then that distributes them to where it needs to go. Right now, I'm moving my hands in um, sort of making gestures as I'm speaking to you, and that's being controlled by the brain, right? My brain is sending signals right now. I'm just flexing my fingers a little bit. If you saw me in person, you would see that. Well, do it yourself, right? Just wiggle your fingers around. What's going on is that your brain is sending a little message in the form of a bit of electricity. Don't get scared. Yes, there is electricity in the brain. The brain is basically a computer. well, not basically, a computer is basically a brain. Actually, the brain was here first, right? It's not a chicken or the egg situation. Well, kind of is. The brain is the most complex computing system, right? The amount of information that it can interpret and store is phenomenal, right? It's a very, very active field of study right now. I know so at UCT, there's the Neuroscience Institute at the Kritiski Hospital. They're studying all kinds of things related to the brain and the how it works, how it moves, how it stores, how it interprets, how it organizes, all kinds of things. Very fascinating. So if you're ever interested in that, that would be nice, right? Now, when we talk about um, impulses, as I said again, it is electricity. Yes. So your neurons, like little electrical cables, you know how you get power stations and these pylons that conduct electricity, right? So these cables wound through it that's carrying your power lines. They transmit this electricity to your houses where it's used, to substations, to the grid basically, right? To the whole system of electricity. You know how you get electricity in your house. It's kind of the same thing, which means that those cables need to be able to conduct that electricity to carry it. Similarly, your neurons, right, have these little threads, strings, kind of like a powered cable called an axon. This axon transmits the electricity, transmits the impulse, transmits that piece of information, conducts it, right? And just as you know, power cables have, and they're not exposed, they're not just copper wires, no, they're surrounded by plastic, by rubber, by nylon, all these things to protect it. They serve a couple of purposes. Firstly, it insulates, right? So it protects you from getting electrocuted should one of these cables fall on you. It also maintains a temperature, right? So that the information that goes through, the electricity, can go through, fast without being affected too much. It insulates it, right? It prevents electricity from leaving it, right? So to speak, if there are other sort of situations going on. And similarly, right, your axons also have a little covering called a myelin sheath, right? A sheath, you know what a sheath is, English word, meaning like a covering or like glove kind of thing, right? So sheath, just a little covering, like how you get a knife sheath or a sword sheath, right? A scabbard, basically. So it insulates these axons, and we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to studying the nerves in detail. Before we do that, though, I know I'm starting a little bit backward. I'm doing this very differently from how your teacher would, because I'm not restricted by a teaching plan from the department or anything like that. I can just teach you what you need to know, right? So the nervous system, I'm sure your textbooks are kind of confusing when it comes to what is autonomic, central, sympathetic, parasympathetic, cranial, spinal. What is all of these words? What do they mean? How do they relate to each other? There is a hierarchy, right? The entire system is known as the nervous system, right? So that comprises of your brain and spinal cord and everything, right? Everything. Um, but now there are two subdivisions of your nervous system. So you get your entire nervous system subdivided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. You know what the word peripheral means? Think about peripheral vision. So when you see something at the side of your eye, right, you're not directly looking at it, but you can kind of see things, in wide range. That's periphery. That's called your peripheral vision. So a peripheral nervous system is basically the nervous system on the edge. It's not obviously as important. Well, it is very important, but it's not as fundamental or as necessary as the central nervous system, which is the main one, central, right, being of large importance. So your central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, which do two different things. But firstly, your central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. These are your central um, nervous system anatomy, right? The brain and the spinal column or the spinal cord. Same thing. Um, and the peripheral nervous system is made up of all your cranial and spinal nerves. Okay? So that's kind of easy because if you look at a picture of your spinal column or spinal cord, you'll see just that column itself, and then all these the little nerves coming out the sides. That's the peripheral nervous system. It basically acts auxiliary to the central nervous system. It basically carries out what the central nervous system instructs. Okay, so your cranial and your spinal nerves is your peripheral nervous system on the side and the edge, not doing a main thing, kind of like the side. And your central nervous system, again, is your brain and spinal cord. Now, the peripheral nervous system, they obviously have different jobs as well. Your peripheral nervous system is also called the autonomic nervous system. Okay, autonomic nervous system. What does that mean? Auto means to do by yourself or self, right? So autonomic nervous system means that it kind of takes care of things on its own. It doesn't need to relay it to somewhere else. It doesn't need to take instructions from anyone. It just carries out the function. In more biological terms, this is your involuntary action center, right? As you can see in the purple there, your involuntary action center. So the autonomic nervous system, which is the peripheral nervous system, don't confuse it. So you use the word peripheral when you're referring to it being a subdivision of the nervous system, being a counterpart to the central nervous system, but we use autonomic nervous system when we're referring to its function, when we're referring to what it does. When we're referring to what it's made of or where it is, we talk about peripheral. We use the word peripheral nervous system that's made up of your cranial and spinal nerves. But the autonomic nervous system, which is one and the same thing, is just the term we use when we're referring to its function. So in biology, function is very, very important to us. So that's why there's sort of a slight discrepancy, but not quite, right? It is the same thing, and we just use them differently in different situations. Kind of like you at home, right? Like your parents will call you something, and then at school your friends call you something else. It just depends on your circumstances, on your surroundings, on your environment, on your function, right? In your home, you are the child. So your mother might call you son, come here, right? And in school, you are a friend, you are a student. Your teacher will address you formally, but your friends will call you, by your name, that kind of thing. So that depends on where you are and your relation to those around you. Similarly, when we're referring to autonomic and peripheral, its function is important to us, right? It's the same thing, doing the same thing. But when we refer to it in terms of, as I said, I'm repeating myself, these points are important. When we're referring to what it's made of, or as a subdivision of the nervous system, counterpart to the central nervous system, we use the word peripheral. But when we're referring to its function, we use the word autonomic, right? Involuntary action, it does things on its own. So you are not in control. That's basically what it means. So with your peripheral nervous system, with the autonomic nervous system, you are not in control. You don't dictate things. So right now, if I ask you to wave your hand, right? You wave your hand. You are in control. That is not an involuntary action. That is voluntary. You're doing it yourself. You're bringing about this action by instructing your brain, which then instructs your nerves, instructs your muscles to move in the relative motion that you want it to move in. Okay? But when we're referring to the autonomic nervous system, it doesn't do that. It doesn't, your opinion doesn't matter, quite simply. It does things without you knowing because it needs to keep you alive. So this is involved with more life supporting life, um, um, requiring functions like breathing, right? Breathing, your heart rate, your metabolism, right? You don't tell your pancreas, hey, listen here, you secreted enough glucagon. I want you now to secrete insulin because my sugar is high. You don't do that. It does it on its own, right? And that's because that's a paras. It's a peripheral function. It's involuntary. You don't tell your heartbeat, hey, listen here, slow down. You're doing too fast now. No, you don't do that. It just happens. Your heart just starts racing, right? When you are breathing, right? You don't say, you can't control your breath, but most of the time you don't. You don't think about it. It just happens. You can control blinking. You can stop yourself from blinking, but most of the time you don't bother. It just happens on its own. So involuntary things you're not aware of most of the time, but they are happening. So your metabolism, your breathing, your heart rate, these kinds of things. Now we further subdivide the autonomic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system into sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Right now, what these do, it just basically just talks about the type of action that's brought about. So we already discussed what action is done, involuntary stuff. So your breathing, your heart rate, all of that. Now we separate it because different systems of nerves are used to do different tasks. So the nerves that cause your heart rate to increase, that makes your heart beat faster, are very different, not very, but they are different from the nerves that cause your heartbeat to slow down. just stop beating as fast. The nerves that cause you to breathe faster are different from the nerves that make you breathe slower. Okay, and this difference is attributed to the words sympathetic and parasympathetic. Right, sympathetic meaning it brings about the action, so it's starting the action. Right, it's um, I like to think S for sympathetic, S for starting. So it starts it, makes it go faster. So your sympathetic nerves makes your heart beat faster. Your sympathetic nerves increases your heart rate. Your sympathetic nerves accelerates your glucose absorption in your muscles, that kind of thing, right? Whereas your parasympathetic nerves, or your parasympathetic nervous system, is responsible for slowing down. I think P parasympathetic, P for pause. It pauses things, it slows them down, right? So your parasympathetic nerves would cause your heartbeat to slow down, and your parasympathetic nerves would cause your lungs or rather your respiratory system to breathe slower. Okay, it slows things down, and sympathetic nerves starts things, brings about action. Now, as in green, you can see this says double innervation is when the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerves work antagonistically to one another. Antagonistic means what? Think of English literature, right? When your teacher just refers to the antagonist in the story. If you're a Harry Potter fan, the antagonist is obviously Lord Voldemort, right? The evil guy, the bad guy. So the thing that's the protagonist is the good guy, the hero, right? The person that you want to succeed in the story, and the antagonist is the person that's constantly bringing about their downfall, acting against the protagonist, isn't it? Now, similarly in biology, antagonistically refers to when a system is working opposite or opposing one another. So if you remember grade 10 lessons about your triceps and your biceps in your arm, right? They work antagonistically. Even the radial and circular, sorry, that's the same thing, and um, the muscles in your iris, right? Your eye. When you dilate to accommodate more light and you dilate to and when one contracts, the other relaxes. When one relaxes, the other contracts. They and this makes sense. I just told you that. So your heart rate is increasing. That's your sympathetic nerves. Your parasympathetic nerves work antagonistically to that by bringing the heart rate down. So it's about opposites, right? Now let's go on. These you can see my notes are very specific, very detailed, and I'm explaining so that you understand in terms of what you need to know for the exam as well. They can ask these things, and there was a question on the autonomic nervous system for 5 marks in the trial paper of 2021, right? And what would students have said, right? Because their textbooks didn't have much information, just showed this brief description and then spoke a lot of nonsense, right? They give lots of examples and confuse the learners. So this method is much easier. Everything that I've said, I hope you are taking notes and writing. If not, you can always rewind and so you can just write what I've said. Obviously, structure it in a way that will get you marks, okay? And don't write nonsense. I know students often make a mistake of over-explaining or being too flowery in their answers. While it is very nice to be passionate about the way that you understand the work, you have to understand for the marker, it can be frustrating, right? When they can't find your answer, then a frustrated marker is not very likely to give you all the marks you want to may deserve. So it is important that you keep them happy, so short, concise, make sure they can see, don't make them work to find your answer, present it very clearly, okay? And especially the language that you use is important. Now, receptors obviously receive information. They receive coming from, I mean, that's English even, this is not even bio anymore, receives information in the form of a stimulus, all right? So what is a stimulus? It's the physical factors around you in your environment that changes that you pick up on, right? And that can be a change in the temperature. You suddenly feel cold. Okay, that can be you walk into a particularly nasty area and then start smelling quite bad. That's a stimulus, right? You have olfactory sensors in your nose, which isn't in your syllabus any longer, but it's quite interesting in your nose that pick up the particulates, right, in the air and kind of smells it, right? Has an aroma. Um, It can be, what is this word, a hug, right? Yeah, someone hugs you. That's a stimulus, isn't it? It feels nice, feels warm. Your skin receptors pick this up, and it goes to your brain, and you interpret it as a good feeling, right? If someone slaps you, right, you become hurt. It's your skin receptors again take that stimulus to your brain, and you interpret it as ouch, right? Very, very fascinating, as I said. And that's the stimulus. Now, the information received is, well, in 5 forms: touch, taste, smell, sound, sight, right? Which comes from your surroundings. There are talks about sixth senses and all of that, and it's very uh as an expression, it's more uh, language. Um, but that's not biology. You're not going to be taught that there's a sixth sense in the human being that has not been identified. It hasn't been, don't worry too much about that. Just a feeling. It's not the same thing. Sharks, however, certain organisms do have more than 5 senses. If it's not in your syllabus, of course, we're only studying the human body. But if you look at sharks, right, in their skin, they have these little gel. It's quite really fascinating. I'll actually put a picture in the description or something. It's in their skin, they have these little pits, right? These little pores just beneath their subcutaneous layer, and it has this like gel kind of substance, which is used to pick up electrical impulses. Right now, us human beings, we are not um, aware. We cannot interpret. We cannot feel electrical impulses, like electromagnetic waves, sonar, radar. We do not have the capability to pick up on this type of physical stimulus, but sharks do. So they can literally feel the electrical field coming off a fish that's nearby. They use this obviously for navigation. And there's also talk of birds. So birds use, well, we think, use the electrosphere, that's magnetic field, to find their way north and south, to travel huge distances and go in the correct direction, where we need all these advanced navigation devices like radar and sonar in our planes and ships. Birds do it on their own. So we don't quite know. We think there's a magnetite in their beak, which might allow them to go in the correct direction, but that's still under study, right? So all very interesting things. So those are all, obviously it's biological, right? Which is interesting as well. So we do not have those facilities. We are restricted to our 5 senses, and that's all that we can use to get information from what's around us, right? If you can't see, touch, taste, smell, sound, you wouldn't know anything about the world, right? You would basically be inept. Now, the sense organs are the receptors responsible for taking in this information, so your skin, your eyes, your nose, your tongue. Right now, the nose and the tongue is not in your syllabus. The skin is, briefly. The eyes are, they barely test the skin though, so, but quite interesting. The eye is, and the ear, right, which I have put down a video on earlier. It's there somewhere. Now, receptors, as I've written here, transmits the sense information in the form of an impulse, as I've already discussed, and they send this message, um, but they receive it from the surroundings first. So I included that. I know it seems overly descriptive, but students can get very, very confused. So yes, your receptors sends the impulse, right? But they can only send what they've received, okay? They do not create an impulse to send. That's coming from the brain. So messages come from the receptor, well, originally from the surroundings to the receptor and through the rest of the system, and we'll look at that in a bit, right? And our effectors, right? So um, our muscles or glands, which are told what to do. Okay, so these receive the message and do what they're supposed to do in the form of an impulse. So as I said, say when you are moving your hand, okay, wave it a little bit, right? So what just happened there was that your brain created this electrical impulse along a very familiar pathway because you're used to moving your hand, and it sends this impulse, and it travels along this system of nerves and everything until it reaches that muscle. Then what it does, the muscle is called an effector. Why an effector? Because it carries out the effect. Okay. This is also known as the efferent pathway, right? Interesting. Yeah, you will come to those terms in a while. And that message is transmitted to that muscle in your hand that tells it to constrict or relax in a specific way so that it moves, right? That's what happened. And yeah, so they do what they're told. So effectors do what they're told, whereas receptors tell what they see or tell what they feel or experience or are stimulated by, right? Interesting. I know it's very, very brief, but it's all very interesting. Now we're going to look at the anatomy of the brain. Don't worry, it's nothing detailed at all. Okay, your syllabus is extremely narrow. There's not a lot in it. It's very brief. So don't get scared. Don't think, oh no, I'm studying the brain. The brain is so complicated. It is, but you're not going to be doing the hard parts. All right, just get a brief um, overview of what it is. So this big top part, right? If you can see this, my pointer thing, the little eye, like yeah, this top part is known as your cerebrum. Okay, it is the largest part of the brain. So this it's obviously subdivided into many, many different parts, the frontal lobe and all of that. But for you, for what you need to know right now, it's just that top portion. So you might see this in the reverse direction, but you'll never get a what is it? Sorry, you'll never get a transverse section to the brain. You'll only get this lateral. You'll only get this sagittal section. You won't never get to the brain from the top because you weren't taught how to identify that. So this is the only kind of diagram that you will be able to get in your exam. And this big front portion, the largest part, is known as the cerebrum. There was a label here. I think it's been removed. That is known as cerebrum. Okay, what the cerebrum does is it's divided into your left and right hemispheres. You know that. And the job of the cerebrum is to interpret sensory impulses. Okay, so when you get your message, it goes to the cerebrum and it interprets that. Remember when I said whether you feel if a slap is hard or soft or painful, or if you get a smell and you say, oh, that smells awful, oh, that smells nice, like a flower, or you feel suddenly cold or warm, that interpretation happens in the cerebrum, right? Now that it controls voluntary muscle movements. Okay, controls. So as I said, when you told your arm to wiggle a bit or wave or move, the cerebrum did that. Okay, it said, created that impulse. So the cerebrum is also the seat of higher functions. So like intuition, judgment, reasoning, intelligence, memory, all of that happens in the cerebrum, right? All of this is listed here. If you want, you can take like a screenshot. You should be taking notes as well, but if you want to save this image with all the descriptions and stuff, feel free to pause here and do so, right? Now let's go concentric, okay? That's the cerebrum. Don't confuse it with the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this like tree-like structure, which is it looks like a tree, the way that things are, the lines and stuff are interesting. So what that does is that it coordinates your voluntary functions, right? So coordinates different from controlling. So cerebrum controls voluntary movement, cerebellum coordinates voluntary muscle movement, and secondary function is to regulate posture and balance. So when you study the ear and you look at how the auditory nerve, right, vestibular branch of the auditory nerve goes to the cerebellum to tell you, inform it about whenever your head moves. Okay, so its balance, its position, right, how fast it's moving, and corrects it. So the cerebellum regulates posture and balance, okay? Let's look at this light pink part here. It's called the corpus callosum, right? So going in, you get cerebellum, corpus callosum, thalamus. Hypothalamus is below it, but we'll get there. So the corpus callosum is a bundle of white fibrous tissue, right, which holds the two parts of the brain together. Okay, it holds the brain together and it allows obviously messages to go from the right brain to the left brain, so it coordinates communication between two halves of the brain. It's a bundle of white fibrous tissue, remember that? They can ask you multiple choice, any kinds of thing, right? Corpus callosum. Write it down and you'll have to study it and learn it, of course. Okay, then this blue labeled F is your thalamus. So the thalamus acts as a relay station for nerve impulses, as it's written here. Relay station for nerve impulses, right? This blue. Then below it is hypothalamus. What is the hypothalamus? Well, hypo means below or inferior to, um, and thalamus is this part here. So this part is just named because it's below the thalamus. Hypothalamus, right? It's the lower part of the thalamus. It's called the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is very, very, very important, right? It is the control center for homeostasis, for hormone regulation, right? And its function is absolutely crucial. It produces very, very, very important hormones. It's responsible. It has a very large role in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, right? Which is the system which coordinates hormones and directs them to different parts of the body. It controls your glandular secretions, right? But apart from that, it also regulates emotional um, feelings and stuff like that. So emotions and whatnot, right? So if you look here, these things are written here, basic, but what I've told you. Okay, below it, this little like bilobe, two lobes, having two lobes. This is an anterior lobe, and that's your posterior lobe, right, of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is known as the master gland, right? So the master gland secretes all your very, very, very vital hormones in the body, which are important for homeostasis, right? If you look here, it secretes hormones directly into the bloodstream, right? The pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis, right? And we'll study that when we do the endocrine system, right? So that's all of it except these two tubes. So the central canal is above, like it's this upper portion, to the medulla oblongata, right? Which is the back towards your back. It's closest to your neck, basically, right? This is the back of your brain, right? This person is facing to the right. Okay, so no, that's not right. No, it's correct. Sorry. Yeah, the person is facing to the right. So the medulla oblongata is it's kind of like side to side situation. It's kind of interwoven. Just know that there's a distinction between them when you're labeling in the exam, right? This is known as the medulla oblongata, which is also a very, very important part. It's responsible for like regulating your heart rate and all sorts of things, as it said here, right? So regulates heartbeat, regulates dilation of blood vessels, coordinates coughing, sneezing, and swallowing, and it controls involuntary muscle movements. So what are involuntary muscle movements? Parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, your autonomic nervous system. Don't say it's part of that, please. That's not what anyone told you. It just, yeah, coincidence. So the medulla oblongata controls or regulates, coordinates your involuntary action like heart rate and your ventilation. Your ventilation is basically your breathing and blood flow, all kinds of things, right? Blood pressure, all of that. This is called your pons. Okay, it's just a little part there. It's nothing major for you to know now. And yes, all your labels are covered. The central canal has a very, very important job of secreting, or rather containing, cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is this fluid that's found throughout your spinal cord, right? You know, you get a spinal tap when you test it for certain types of diseases. They do a spinal tap. They put a large, very thick, I think it's 18 gauge needle into your spinal column very carefully. Obviously, the doctors are very well trained in doing this, and they have to draw out spinal fluid. And if it's cloudy, it's an indication that something is wrong, and things like that, right? So the cerebrospinal fluid is important for a variety of reasons. It protects and it nourishes cells, right, that are in the brain. It keeps them alive. It maintains a constant pressure in the brain, so the brain requires a certain amount of pressure, right, um, to work nicely. And the presence of the fluid, right, maintains that pressure. There's a case when a child might have hydrocephaly, right? When they're born, that's when they secrete too much cerebrospinal fluid, and it's their brain begins to swell, right? They get these abnormally large heads, and it has to be drained with a little duct that's placed in by a neurosurgeon. Very common disease, but very, very sad. It can be fatal, but it can also you can also recover from it, right? The child can be quite fine. The cerebrospinal fluid also, so you need a certain amount of it there, obviously. It also prevents desiccation of cells. Remember these word for word, right? These are from memos. Prevents desiccation of cells. Desiccation means cells die, become destroyed, become old, and it also removes metabolic wastes from the cells, right? Which is important because the blood flow there isn't as great. You know, you can actually do open brain surgery without any anesthetic in the brain. Why? Because your brain doesn't have any nerves. Well, any pain receptors rather, right? And that's kind of ironic, but also kind of cool. Okay, now with the brain, right, you have to understand that gray matter is on the outside and white matter is on the inside. Gray matter is comprised of, and I could have showed you pictures because we did it this year in uni. So gray matter is comprised of neuron cell bodies. So cell bodies, when we look at the structure of a neuron, you'll see. And white matter is made of the nerve fibers. So your nerve fibers are kind of shiny because it's myelinated, and so it shows as white. Okay, whereas the gray, um, darker part is comprised of neuron cell bodies. Okay, little globs. Um, yeah, it stains blue, actually, very interesting when you look at the histology. So gray on the outside, white on the inside, right? Remember that for the brain. Cool. Let's talk about the spinal cord. What is the spinal cord? The spinal cord is a cylindrical structure, okay, which is located in the vertebral canal of the vertebral column, or the spinal column. Okay, you know that much. You know what a spinal cord is, and it extends from the medulla oblongata. So from this portion here, the medulla oblongata, there's a bright pink area, all the way down to the um, border of the second lumbar vertebra in adults. So in children, it extends somewhere else. You don't need to know, but just know for classic normal human being, second lumbar vertebra, that's the base of the spine, basically, right? Just before the pelvis. Okay. And that's the you know what that is. Okay. Now there are three layers. We have three layers protecting the spinal cord: the dura mater, the arachnoid layer, and the pia mater. Okay. The arachnoid layer is so named because it's very like fibrous. It looks like spider webs. So arachnoid meaning like spidery. So that, yeah, dura mater, arachnoid layer, pia mater, DAP. Okay, so inside to outside. Okay, we good? Nice. So the brain is protected by three layers, or rather the spinal cord is protected by three layers, or not three layers, three things. Okay, the meninges are the layers of tissue that protect the brain. So that's your dura, arachnoid, and pia layers, right? But your spinal cord is protected by the vertebra, right? Because of the bones, obviously, that surround it, so that when you fall, anything doesn't get damaged. But when you like use your back too much, or older people and stuff, you get hernias, there's kinks in the spine, all sorts of things can happen. But it's one of the things that's meant to protect your spinal cord. The meninges, which are your three layers, and the cerebrospinal fluid, which does all these things above here, right? As I mentioned. But now in the spinal cord, okay, gray matter is surrounded by the white matter. So there's like an inversion between these layers. So just remember, the brain, it's gray, then white inside. In the spinal cord, it's white, gray inside. Okay. Now the function of the spinal cord, and what that looks like now. The function of the spinal cord is to conduct impulses from receptors to the brain. Okay. And it conducts impulses. Oops, what just happened? No, we're fine, right? And it conducts impulses from the brain to effectors, muscles and glands, as we spoke about earlier. Okay, so um the spinal cord also acts as a reflex center for involuntary actions, which we are going to study in detail now, right? Let's do that. What's on here? So the reflex, these are some definitions that you need to know for your exam. Reflex is a fast, automatic response to changes in the environment, whereas the reflex arc is the path that's taken by an impulse in response to a stimulus. Remember, I spoke about when you touch something hot and you move your hand away, that's a reflex arc, right? And we're going to look at how that information is carried throughout the body through nerves, okay? And it's given here, and I will talk about that. We'll talk about that now using this diagram, right? So this is the anatomy. Yes, I drew this of the spinal cord. Well, it's a transverse section, okay? Yeah, so let's look at this. So the outer, this is your spinal. Ignore that little like branch thing that's coming out. Let's look at this middle central part first, right? So we've got this dorsal fissure at the top, that little kink. Okay, at the bottom we've got it's called the ventral cleft. So you know the words dorsal means above, right, and ventral below. So dorsal and ventral. You know, when you studied the leaf in grade 10, you looked at the dorsiventral surface of the leaf. Okay, which means top to bottom. A dorsiventral section, top to bottom section of the leaf, and that means to remember that D comes before V in the alphabet. It's just an easy way that I remember it. So dorsal means on the top, then V on the bottom. If you write out the alphabet top to bottom, D comes before V, right? So D on the top and V at the bottom, right? Now the dorsal fissure, ventral cleft. Okay, this is your dorsal root, this is your ventral root, right? The pink, the green is ventral, the pink is dorsal, so named just because of its anatomical position. The D is on the top, it's the upper portion, so dorsal. The V is at the bottom, it's the ventral portion, right? Simple, straightforward, nothing complicated. Then surrounding the spinal cord, we have three layers. Well, actually around this there's also a bone, okay, but that's not shown for all these reasons, so it's easier to see this. There's three layers, right? Your meninges. Okay, when you get meningitis, it's an infection of the layers surrounding your brain. It can be a really big problem. But the meninges consists of your dura mater on the outside, the pink, your arachnoid layer, the blue, in the center, and the pia mater, which is the grayish white on the inside, right? The third innermost layer. Then we have your white matter, and right at the center, the gray matter portions, right? And then all the way, like the exact middle is your central canal, okay, which contains the cerebral spinal fluid, right, in your spinal column. Now let's look at these lines. What are these? This is the directions that's taken a um, by impulses, okay? Interesting, right? So let's look at the path. Let's trace it. Let's look at what happens. So say, let's look at a situation where you are touching a hot stove, right? I'm sure your teacher will go through the same thing with you as well. So when you touch a hot stove, okay, this is your skin, right? When you do the structure of the skin, you'll see it looks like this. Those are hair follicles. That's your epidermis, your dermis, and all of that. These are your fat cells and whatnot. So you have an innervation of nerves, like means penetrating the area and infiltrates everything. So there's a lot of nerves. So your skin is there, and these are receptors in the skin. Okay, so something hot is here. So you touch something hot with your finger, and it heats up, and your nerves detect that heat and is able to convert that information, that stimulus, to an impulse. That's what the receptor does, and transmits it to this nerve fiber, right? And travels all the way, comes up here through the afferent neuron or the sensory neuron, right? All the way up the sensory neuron, past the dorsal root ganglion. That's what this thing is here. It's basically a collection of cell bodies, of sensory cell nerve bodies, and all the way up the sensory neuron into the spinal column, right? Into the white matter, sorry, into the gray, past the white matter, into the gray matter of the spinal column. Okay, in the gray matter, that impulse travels across a synapse to an interneuron, where it crosses through another synapse, right, from that interneuron, and jumps to, what is this, a motor neuron, right, an efferent neuron, and travels through this efferent neuron all the way, all the way through this motor neuron, right, to the muscle. This is muscle striated muscle tissue, as you can see, and it tells your arm to move away very quickly. And all of this happens in the fraction of a second, and then this muscle contracts. Okay, so just follow the diagram and name everything in it, and you'll get all your marks, right? This is it in words written out. Let's read it out formally. So receptors receive the stimulus. Okay, stimulus is converted into nerve impulses. The impulse travels along sensory neuron towards the spinal cord, through the dorsal root to the spinal nerve. Within the gray matter, the sensory neuron makes a synaptic contact with the interneuron. See the words? Which makes synaptic contact with a motor neuron. The impulse travels along this, right? The impulse is transmitted through along the ventral root, right? Through the motor neuron, right, along the ventral root of the spinal cord, all the way to the effector organ, the muscle or gland, which causes it to contract. And this reflex action provides a rapid response to the stimulus and minimizes injury. So you'll say this bottom part, you'll kind of adjust it to your situation given in the exam. If it's a hot stove, you'll say, away from the heat. If it's uh, stepping on a nail, right, and moving your foot back really fast, right, you'll say pain and all of that. So it adjusted to fit the situation, but this, you can screen grab it or learn it by heart, but understand, very importantly, what's actually going on here. It's easier. I don't remember this, right? I don't know what I can't tell you this, but I can if I remember my anatomy, if I think about what's happening, right, on an anatomical level, what is happening from the skin to the spinal cord, to the muscles, what is going on. Where look at this diagram, remember the labels, and I was able to give it to you perfectly, the explanation. So you must be able to do the same thing in the exam. Understanding is more important than rote learning. In life science, you may think it's standing in front of a mirror and saying things to yourself 100 times. No, That's the misconception. To get 90s, to get 100 to do well, understanding is priority. Okay, understand what's going on in the system and you will be fine. Now, I think I want to give like a nice summary here. So receptor, just tracing the path, right? So it goes from the receptor to the sensory neuron, to the spinal cord, to the interneuron, to the motor neuron, to the effector. Okay, so the effector is a muscle gland, as I said. I keep saying the same thing because it's important. People forget. So once you do that, they can ask you multiple choice questions to trace the path and all of that. Make sure you understand it. Okay, let's look at the structure of neuron. So neurons contain a nucleus and they have a cell body as well. So the cell body of neurons has a nucleus. Little Nissl granules, which we'll look at in the, oops, what's going on here? Those Nissl granules, which we'll look at in the diagram just now, are composed of RNA. You don't need to know why, just need to know that they do. Then we have dendrites. There we go. Dendrites, which transmit impulses towards the cell body. They're like little elongations, right? Axons transmits impulses away from the cell body. So as I said, it's our system of conduction, the power lines carrying the electrical impulse. Then we have this fatty sort of substance called myelin, which is secreted by oligodendrocytes and all of that, which you don't need to know, and satellite cells and Schwann cells. But it basically forms myelin. Myelin, a myelin sheath, which surrounds the nerve fibers, right? Insulating the nerve fiber, which allows the nerve fiber, the axon, to conduct the impulse faster or more efficiently. That's important. So the myelin sheath is not continuous, right? But it's interrupted by constricting or constriction. So it's little squeezing. So it's not a continuous sheath like a cover, cylindrical cover. It has little constrictions. It's squeezed in certain areas, and those squeezings are called nodes, nodes of Ranvier, right? Which you don't need to know what they do or why, but they you need to know that they're there in your syllabus, right? The curriculum. So as now everything in bio, neurons have an outer membrane. You know, the outer membrane of your muscles is called the sarcolemma, right? The outer membrane of the neuron is called the neurolemma, right? Lemma just means a casing or covering in Latin. So a neural membrane is just known as a neurolemma. So that's the basic structure of any neuron. Let's look at specific neurons. There are three types of neurons you're going to learn about: motor, sensory, and interconnected neurons. This is a motor neuron. How do I know? Because of this. This kind of looks like a trampoline kind of thing to me, and I just know that that's a motor neuron. So the cell body looks like this. It's a motor neuron. These are the Nissl granules, nucleus, and your dendrites, so your dendritic branches. Dendritic, a dendron, right, in Greek is a tree. Okay, so dendritic is tree-like. You know how trees branch out like in that structure. If you do geography, you know dendritic patterns of rivers. It's like tree-like branching. That's the same thing with dendrites. They're tree-like extensions of the axon from the cell bodies, which transmit the nerve impulse and whatnot, right? Or receive rather. These dendrites receives the impulse, and it's traveled along the axon, as you can see, travels along the axon to the motor end plates. Okay, and as the axon, these are the nodes of Ranvier, these little constrictions. The myelin sheath is surrounding that axon. The very, very outer layer is known as the neurolemma. So your motor neurons will lead away from your central nervous system, okay? And it conveys the impulse to your effectors. It sends messages, which enables muscles to either constrict or relax or do whatever they need to do in response to the environmental stimulus. Okay, the impulse travels from the cell body to the motor end plates through the axon, right, away from the cell body. That's where this is in the muscle, these motor end plates telling the muscle what to do. Now let's look at a sensory neuron. Sensory neuron kind of looks like a little alien blob kind of thing. That's the cell body, right? Now they have dendrites here. Okay, you can see the arrows. That means that the impulse is traveling from somewhere else through the dendrites, past into the axon, away from the cell body and towards the synaptic knobs. So here we had motor end plates. In the sensory neuron, we have synaptic knobs. Now this is known as your terminal branches of the axon. These are just your dendrites. So this is not dendrites. These are terminal branches of the axon with synaptic knobs. Okay, you can see the node of Ranvier there, the myelin sheath covering the axon, your cell body with your Nissl granules and a nucleus. Right, they can ask you for any of the labels. Impulse goes again from the dendrites through the cell, away from the cell body, through the axon to the synaptic knobs to transmit the impulse, right? some information here, which I've already said, nothing out of the way, and then this little diagram. Okay, let it load. Great. So this is called an interneuron or an interconnector neuron. It basically shows, yeah, how impulses are moved across a synapse. A synapse is a microscopic gap between two neurons, which allows for the transmission of impulses, right? So just know the labels. There's some mitochondria there for energy. There's little vesicles. You don't need to know why. They're just there. And this is the impulse traveling, the dotted line, because they're jumping, quotation jumping, right? Electrically or chemically induced jumps, right? From this one to this one, because it's not through. So the proper definition for a synapse is what? A synapse is a functional connectivity between two neurons without direct protoplasmic continuity. So what that means is that it's a functional connectivity, meaning it allows two neurons to be connected and things move across that connection, hence functional connectivity between two neurons, as we said, but there's no direct protoplasmic continuity. What does that mean? That means this is not one, they do not share cytoplasm or a protoplasm. It leaves this cell and enters the other cell. There's no continuation of the protoplasm, right? So this is a nice, very concise, very thorough definition which you can use. And this is called your synaptic knob, by the way. And the synaptic cleft is the actual gap. And this just receives, right? So the synaptic hormones are responsible for the rate of transmission. Oh, yes. So how fast impulses are moved from the synaptic knob through here depends on the synaptic hormones, right? Which, yeah, simple enough. So yeah, right now, if you look at this reflex arc, one thing I want to mention is a certain question that they like to test is what happens if this is damaged? Where I'm pointing at the efferent neuron, the motor neuron is damaged. They can ask you to label it and say what happens when part A or part B or the part labeled in 5.1.1 is damaged. Then you will have to say in the reflex arc, well, the person will feel the stimulus, they'll receive it, they'll interpret it, they'll feel the pain of being burnt or stepping on a nail or something's happening, but they will be unable to react to it. Why would they be unable to react? Because obviously the motor neuron is not working anymore. It's unable to transmit the impulse and the person cannot move, which means they will get burnt. It will result in an injury, and that's a problem. So they just want you to be able to use a scenario. They'll change something in it, and you'll have to say why that change happens. You'll have to say support the consequences, that kind of thing. You want to see if you will be able to handle a hypothetical scenario. It's actually very simple, right? So they can ask you anything, and you just need to be able to use its function and see what now will happen because of that one change that they made. So this is the normal thing that happens, right? This whole process here. Now, if something is damaged, if this interconnecting neuron is, for example, not working, what would happen? The impulse will never make it to the motor neuron and they won't be able to move, right? So the person will still get burnt if there's a fire there, right? Well, what happens if the sensory neuron is not working? They won't be able to feel the pain and they would still get burnt. The injury will still be there, right? Interesting. And all kinds of things. What happens if the one of the layers of the meninges fails? Well, it leaves the spinal cord prone to exposure, to damage, right? So be able to make these little connections and support your argument with the anatomy and the physiology and all of that, right? Well, that is the whole of the nervous system for your syllabus, right? There's obviously sensory organs, which you do in a bit more detail. But that's it for now. Have fun. Boop. Okay. End this recording.